Abel Garcia was a helicopter crew chief in Vietnam who survived being shot down over Laos when a .50 caliber round tore through his aircraft, and then he and his crew improvised repairs using tire rubber and washers to fly their crippled Chinook back to base, with only an eighth of an inch of teeth left on the transmission, before it would have failed catastrophically and killed them all. This is one of those stories that makes you realize how thin the line between life and death really was for the men who flew helicopters in Vietnam, how much depended on skill and improvisation and sheer luck, and how the bonds between crew members could mean the difference between making it home and becoming another name on the wall. Abel Garcia's experience that day, from the premonition he felt that morning to the desperate repairs at Khe Sanh, to the low-level flight home with tree branches caught in the landing gear, tells us something important about what helicopter crews went through in that war, about the constant danger and the remarkable resilience of the young men who kept those aircraft flying no matter what. So let's slow down and really look at this story, because understanding the helicopter war in Vietnam means understanding the crew chiefs and door gunners who were just as essential as the pilots, and because stories like Abel Garcia's deserve to be remembered and told properly. The helicopter was the defining technology of the Vietnam War, the vehicle that made the American way of fighting possible in that difficult terrain of jungles and mountains and rice paddies, where roads were few and reliable, and enemy ambushes were common everywhere. The geography of Vietnam presented challenges that conventional ground forces couldn't easily overcome. The jungle was dense in many areas, limiting visibility and making movement on foot exhausting and slow. The road network was primitive by American standards, with many routes little more than dirt paths that became impassable during the monsoon season. The enemy knew this terrain intimately and used it to their advantage, setting ambushes along the few usable roads, melting into the jungle when pursued, and emerging to strike again when conditions favored them. The Americans needed a way to move troops and supplies that didn't depend on roads, a way to project force anywhere in the country without the delays and vulnerabilities of ground transport. The helicopter provided that capability. The Americans had used helicopters in Korea, but Vietnam was the first war where they became truly central to military operations, where the distinctive sound of rotor blades became the soundtrack of the conflict for everyone who was there. The UH-1 Huey was the most famous helicopter of the war, the iconic aircraft that appeared in all the news footage and all the movies afterward, its distinctive profile and sound forever associated with Vietnam in the popular imagination. The Huey was versatile and reliable, capable of carrying troops into combat, evacuating wounded, providing fire support, and performing dozens of other missions that kept the American war effort functioning. But the Huey wasn't the only helicopter in the American arsenal, and for certain missions, other aircraft were even more important. The CH-47 Chinook was the heavy lifter of the helicopter war, the aircraft that could carry loads that were far beyond the capability of the smaller Hueys. The Chinook was a tandem rotor helicopter with two massive rotors spinning in opposite directions to provide the lift needed to carry enormous weights. Where a Huey might carry 8 or 10 combat-loaded troops, a Chinook could carry 30 or more, or it could carry artillery pieces and their ammunition, or vehicles, or supplies, or almost anything else that the military needed to move to places that couldn't be reached by road. The Chinook's size and capacity made it indispensable for the kind of war the Americans were fighting in Vietnam, where bases were scattered across remote terrain and needed constant resupply, where artillery had to be positioned on hilltops and mountaintops to provide fire support, where the logistics of keeping hundreds of thousands of troops supplied and equipped required a massive airlift capability that only the helicopters could provide. The Chinook required a crew that was larger and more specialized than the Huey's smaller team. The pilots sat up front, managing the complex systems that kept the twin rotors synchronized and the aircraft flying. But they couldn't do their job without the crew chiefs and door gunners who worked in the rear of the aircraft. The crew chief was responsible for the mechanical condition of the helicopter, for ensuring that everything worked properly, for diagnosing problems and implementing solutions, for managing the cargo and passengers, and for defending the aircraft with the heavy machine gun mounted at one of the doors. The door gunner provided additional firepower, manning another machine gun position and watching for threats that the pilots couldn't see from the cockpit. Together, this crew formed a team where each member depended on the others, where trust and competence were matters of life and death. Abel Garcia was a crew chief on Chinooks, which meant he was responsible for knowing his aircraft intimately, for being able to keep it flying under conditions that would have defeated a lesser mechanic or a less determined man. Being a crew chief wasn't just about turning wrenches, although that was certainly part of it. It was about understanding how all the systems of the helicopter worked together, about being able to diagnose problems from subtle clues that a less experienced person would miss, about improvising solutions when the proper parts weren't available and the mission couldn't wait. The crew chief's relationship with his aircraft was almost personal, a connection built through hours of maintenance and hundreds of flights, through the intimate knowledge that came from being responsible for every aspect of the helicopter's mechanical condition. Garcia had developed this relationship through training and experience, had built the confidence that came from understanding machines and knowing how to make them work even when they didn't want to. The crew chief's job didn't end when the aircraft left the ground. In flight, the crew chief monitored the helicopter's systems, watched for signs of trouble, and stood ready to deal with any problems that developed. The crew chief also operated one of the door guns, providing defensive firepower when the aircraft came under attack, and serving as an extra set of eyes watching for enemy threats. This dual role as both mechanic and gunner meant that crew chiefs had to be skilled in two very different disciplines, had to be able to switch between careful technical work and the quick violence of combat without missing a beat. It was a demanding job that required a particular kind of person, someone who could stay calm under pressure and think clearly when everything was chaos. The helicopter crews in Vietnam operated under conditions that tested everything they had, flying missions that took them into some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth. The enemy had developed effective tactics for shooting down helicopters, using heavy machine guns positioned along flight routes, rocket-propelled grenades that could knock a helicopter out of the sky with a single hit, and sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons supplied by the Soviet Union and China. The helicopters themselves were vulnerable by design, their thin aluminum skins offering little protection against even small arms fire, their complex mechanical systems susceptible to damage that could cause catastrophic failure. Every mission was a roll of the dice, and the crews knew it, understood that any flight could be the one where their luck ran out, where the enemy gunner's aim was true, and their aircraft became another wreck scattered across the Vietnamese landscape. The crews developed rituals and superstitions to cope with the constant danger, ways of dealing psychologically with the knowledge that they were always one burst of gunfire away from disaster. Some carried good luck charms, items that had been with them through previous close calls and that seemed to offer some protection against the random violence of war. Others developed specific routines that they followed before each mission, patterns of behavior that imposed some sense of order and control on situations that were fundamentally beyond anyone's control. They wore their dog tags on their boots instead of around their necks, a grim precaution that ensured their bodies could be identified even if the worst happened. Even if the crash or the fire that killed them left their upper bodies unrecognizable. It was a practical measure that said everything about the environment they were operating in. The matter-of-fact acknowledgement of death that became part of daily life for the helicopter crews. Abel Garcia and his fellow crew members had their own particular practice with their chicken plates, the heavy body armor that was supposed to protect their vital organs from enemy fire. The chicken plates were uncomfortable and cumbersome, weighing somewhere between 50 and 75 pounds, depending on the specific type. And wearing them made an already demanding job even more physically exhausting. The heat inside the helicopter was oppressive, especially when the aircraft was sitting on the ground with the engines running, and adding heavy armor to that environment made the discomfort almost unbearable. So the crews found their own way to use the armor, placing it between their legs rather than wearing it on their chests, a choice that prioritized protecting what they considered most important to their future happiness, even if it left their torsos more vulnerable to the rounds that might come through the aircraft's thin skin. It was a dark joke and a practical decision rolled into one, the kind of adaptation that combat produces when official equipment and doctrine don't quite match the realities of the situation. Garcia and his crew laughed about it among themselves, understood that it was kind of stupid from a purely tactical perspective, but did it anyway. Because in Vietnam, you learned to take your humor where you could find it, and to make your own choices about how to face the risks that couldn't be avoided. The military couldn't legislate every aspect of how soldiers behaved in combat, couldn't control the small personal decisions that individuals made to maintain their sanity and their sense of agency in situations where so much was beyond their control. The chicken plate between the legs was one of those decisions, a small rebellion against the regulation way of doing things that also served as a bonding ritual among the crews who shared the joke. The operations that the Chinooks flew often took them across the border into Laos, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail snaked through the mountains and the North Vietnamese moved the supplies that kept their war effort going. The trail was one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. A network of paths and roads and way stations that stretched for thousands of miles through the jungles and mountains of Laos and Cambodia, connecting North Vietnam to the battlefields in the south. The North Vietnamese had built this network over years of effort, constantly improving and expanding it, developing alternate routes that allowed them to keep supplies flowing even when American bombing damaged particular sections. Trucks and bicycles and human porters moved weapons and ammunition and food and medicine down the trail, a river of supplies that sustained the communist forces fighting in South Vietnam. The Americans tried everything they could think of to cut this supply line, from massive bombing campaigns to electronic sensors to special operations raids. But the trail kept functioning, the supplies kept flowing, and the North Vietnamese kept fighting. The operations in Laos were officially secret, part of a covert war that the American government didn't acknowledge publicly because Laos was supposed to be neutral under international agreements. But the helicopter crews who flew those missions knew exactly how real and how dangerous the work was, knew that the Laotian border was just a line on a map that offered no protection from the enemy gunners waiting along the trail. The heavy lifters like the Chinooks were essential for supporting the operations in Laos, carrying artillery pieces and ammunition to positions that overlooked the trail, resupplying the special operations teams that operated in the jungle, evacuating casualties and delivering reinforcements to bases that couldn't be reached any other way. These piggyback missions, as the crews called them, involved carrying a howitzer and its ammunition at the same time, maximizing the efficiency of each flight, but also increasing the vulnerability of the aircraft. The heavy loads limited the Chinook's maneuverability, made it harder to evade enemy fire or respond quickly to threats, and the external cargo created drag that slowed the aircraft and reduced its range. Flying into Laos with a howitzer hanging beneath the aircraft and cases of ammunition stacked in the cargo bay was one of the most dangerous missions the Chinook crews performed. And they performed it regularly because the war required it, and there was no other way to get the job done. On the morning that would change everything for Abel Garcia and his crew, Garcia woke up with a feeling that something wasn't right. It was a sensation in his chest, around his heart, something he initially dismissed as gas from the beer they had been drinking the night before. The crews drank when they could, a way of releasing the tension that built up from constant exposure to danger, a way of bonding with each other and forgetting, at least for a few hours, the reality of what they faced every time they took off. But this feeling was different from a hangover or an upset stomach. It was a nagging sense of unease that wouldn't quite go away no matter how much Garcia tried to ignore it. A premonition that something bad was going to happen even though he couldn't have explained what, or why, or how. He knew. Garcia had been in country long enough to learn to pay attention to such feelings, had seen enough in Vietnam to know that intuition sometimes told you things that conscious thought couldn't quite articulate. The guys who dismissed such feelings, who pushed through when something told them to be careful, they were sometimes the ones who didn't come home. Garcia didn't ignore the feeling, couldn't ignore it even if he had wanted to, and he found himself telling the other crew members to wear their chicken plates that day, repeating the advice even though he knew they would probably put the armor between their legs the same way they always did. The feeling stayed with him as they went through their pre-flight routine, as they checked the aircraft and loaded the cargo and went through all the familiar steps that preceded every mission. It was still there when they took off and headed toward Laos, a background hum of anxiety that he couldn't quite shake, no matter how many times he tried to rationalize it away. The mission that day was a piggyback run, one of those combined lifts that carried maximum cargo at maximum risk. They were carrying a 105mm howitzer, one of the workhorses of American artillery in Vietnam. A gun that could provide accurate fire support to troops in contact with the enemy, that could break up enemy attacks or soften enemy positions before an assault. The 105 wasn't the biggest gun in the American arsenal. That would be the 155mm, or the 8-inch howitzers that delivered even more destructive firepower. But it was versatile and mobile, easier to position in the remote locations where artillery was needed, and faster to get into action once it arrived. Getting a 105 to a hilltop fire support base in Laos required the heavy lift capability that only the Chinook could provide. And that's what Garcia's crew was doing that morning. Along with the howitzer, they were carrying the ammunition that would feed it, cases of shells that would be expended in fire missions over the coming days, the logistical tail that every artillery piece required to remain useful. Abel Garcia was running crew chief for the flight, performing the duties he knew so well on an aircraft he had maintained and flown on many times before. Another crew member named Hines was training up to take on more crew chief responsibilities, getting the experience he would need to eventually run his own ship, and a third crew member named John was working the door gun position. The aircraft commander was Captain Malazzo, an experienced pilot who had logged hundreds of hours in the Chinook and knew how to handle the big helicopter in the challenging conditions they operated in. The flight into Laos proceeded without incident, the kind of routine mission that the crews had flown hundreds of times before. Routine was a relative term in Vietnam, where routine meant flying into airspace where people were actively trying to kill you. But this particular flight didn't encounter any problems on the way in. They delivered their load to the fire support base, watched the artillery crews begin the process of setting up the howitzer, and then turned back toward South Vietnam, toward the base at Khe Sanh, where they could refuel and prepare for whatever mission came next. Khe Sanh was a name that carried heavy significance in the Vietnam War, a remote combat base near the Laotian border that had been the site of one of the most famous sieges of the conflict. In early 1968, North Vietnamese forces had surrounded Khe Sanh and pounded it with artillery for months, in what some observers compared to the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The Marines who held Khe Sanh had been resupplied entirely by air, the roads being too dangerous to use, and the helicopter crews had played a crucial role in keeping the base alive until the siege was finally lifted. By the time of Garcia's mission, the siege was history. But Khe Sanh remained an important staging point for operations in the area, a place where helicopters could land and refuel before continuing their missions. As Garcia's Chinook flew back from Laos, crossing the terrain that separated enemy territory from the relative safety of South Vietnam, Garcia finally gave in to the feeling that had been bothering him all morning. He got up from his position and put on his chicken plate, wearing it properly on his chest instead of positioning it between his legs the way he usually did. It was a small decision, almost instinctive, but it was a decision that might have saved his life when the shooting started just minutes later. The enemy announced their presence on the radio before Garcia ever saw them fire a shot. Vietnamese voices came over the American frequencies, jamming their communications with chatter that blocked normal coordination. The crews told them to get off the radio, using the Vietnamese slang "Diddy Mao," that meant, "Get out of here, get lost." But the jamming continued, a sure sign that the enemy knew they were coming and had prepared a reception. Through the helicopter's windows, Garcia could see smoke rising from positions ahead of them, the telltale sign of weapons firing, the visual confirmation of what the radio jamming had already suggested. They were flying into an ambush, and there was no way to avoid it, no way to turn back or climb away or do anything except fly through and hope that the enemy gunners missed. The Chinook was coming in short, approaching at low altitude because that's how you flew in enemy territory, staying close to the ground to reduce the time you were exposed to enemy fire. The disadvantage of low altitude was that it put you within range of everything the enemy had, from the smallest rifles to the heavy machine guns that could tear a helicopter apart with a few well-placed rounds. Garcia heard the AK-47s first, the distinctive rattling sound of the communist assault rifle that was one of the most recognizable weapons of the war. The AK rounds missed, either passing by the aircraft entirely or hitting parts that could absorb the damage without critical effect. But the .50 caliber machine gun that opened up right after found its mark with terrible precision. The .50 caliber was a heavy machine gun, the same basic weapon that the Americans used on their own vehicles and aircraft, capable of firing rounds that were half an inch in diameter and could penetrate armor that stopped smaller bullets. When a .50 caliber round hit a helicopter, it didn't just make a hole. It tore through structure and systems, could kill the crew, or destroy the mechanical components that kept the aircraft flying. Garcia heard the distinctive booming of the .50 caliber, a deeper, heavier sound than the AK fire. And then, the rounds were punching through the Chinook's skin, finding targets with the terrible efficiency of heavy machine gun fire aimed at a slow-moving aircraft. The .50 caliber rounds came in on the right side of the aircraft, where Garcia was positioned, and the damage they caused was immediate and severe. Captain Milazzo had just announced that he was taking the controls from the co-pilot, a routine transfer of control authority that happened to occur at exactly the worst possible moment. One of the .50 caliber rounds hit the pedal assembly on the co-pilot's side, the controls that allowed the pilot to manage the helicopter's yaw. And the round didn't just damage the pedal, it destroyed it completely, shattering it into fragments that also found the co-pilot's leg. The co-pilot started screaming from the sudden pain of being wounded, a natural response that would have happened to anyone. and from that moment forward, the crew would refer to him by a nickname derived from his exclamation. It was dark humor of the kind that helped crews process traumatic experiences, a way of domesticating the horror by turning it into a joke that could be shared. The damage to the Chinook was catastrophic and getting worse with every passing second. The fuel cells, the self-sealing tanks that were supposed to prevent fuel from leaking when hit by enemy fire, had taken 2 direct hits from the 50 caliber rounds, and these hits were too severe for the self-sealing feature to contain. Fuel was streaming out of the aircraft, draining away the resource they needed to stay airborne, and if the leaks weren't stopped, they would run dry before they could reach safety. Even worse, another round had hit the combining transmission, the critical mechanical component at the top of the aircraft that synchronized the 2 rotors and allowed the Chinook to fly. The transmission was pouring oil now, the lubricant that kept the gears from grinding themselves to pieces, flowing out through the bullet hole and running down through the aircraft. Without that oil, the transmission would overheat and fail, and when it failed, the rotors would lose synchronization and the helicopter would tear itself apart in midair. There would be no surviving that kind of failure, no emergency landing possible, just a catastrophic breakup followed by a crash that would kill everyone aboard. Abel Garcia felt the helicopter shudder under the impacts, heard the sounds of damage that his crew chief experience told him were very, very bad. He knew from his training and his experience that they were in desperate trouble, that the damage they had sustained might not leave them enough time to reach safety, that every second that passed was another second for something else to fail and send them tumbling out of the sky. Garcia moved through the aircraft, checking the damage, doing his job as crew chief even as the helicopter fought to stay in the air. Captain Milazzo called for the load to be released, understanding immediately that the weight of the howitzer and ammunition they were still carrying from a previous mission was making an already desperate situation impossibly worse. The Chinook was struggling to maintain altitude, the damaged systems and leaking fuel combining to degrade its performance, and every pound of external weight was making it harder to stay in the air. But when the crew tried to release the load using the normal release mechanism, nothing happened. The system had been damaged or jammed by the same barrage that had hit everything else, and the external load remained stubbornly attached to the crippled helicopter. Milazzo reached for the D-ring, the emergency backup release that was supposed to work when the normal system failed, the last-ditch option for situations exactly like this one. He pulled the D-ring with all his strength, but instead of releasing the load, the ring came off in his hand, the cable broken or disconnected somewhere in the damage. The load still wouldn't drop, and the helicopter was still carrying weight it couldn't afford to carry, and they were running out of options as fast as they were running out of altitude. In a moment of desperate improvisation, Captain Milazzo drew his .45 caliber pistol from its holster and shot the cable manually, the gunshot adding another explosion of sound to the chaos inside the already damaged aircraft. The bullet severed the cable, and finally, the howitzer fell away from the aircraft, dropping toward the ground below. It hit at an angle, coming to rest with its barrel pointing straight up at the sky, held in place by the ammunition that was still tied to it and kept it from rolling down the hillside. With the load released, the Chinook had a chance, but that chance was measured in minutes, or maybe seconds, before the damaged transmission ran dry of oil and failed completely. Milazzo broadcast Mayday calls on whatever radio frequencies were still working, the universal distress signal that told everyone listening that an aircraft was going down and needed help. He fought the controls, coaxing every bit of performance he could get from the damaged helicopter, looking for a place to put down before the aircraft became completely unflyable. The nearest American position was Khe Sanh, and that's where Milazzo aimed the stricken Chinook, flying on will and skill and whatever luck they had left. Garcia continued his damage assessment as the helicopter limped toward Khe Sanh, cataloging the destruction the 50 caliber rounds had caused. He found the path one of the rounds had taken through the fuel cell area, traced it through the hydraulic fluid cans they carried for maintenance, 4 cans that now looked like someone had crushed them in a giant fist. The bullet had passed through all 4 cans, expending some of its energy, but still retaining enough to punch through to the other side and come to rest on the floor. There it lay, the 51 caliber enemy round that had nearly killed them all, the piece of metal that had started out in an enemy machine gun and ended up inside their aircraft after passing through fuel cells and hydraulic fluid and everything else in its path. Garcia reached down to pick it up and jerked his hand back immediately, the round still hot from its violent passage. He used his do-rag to pick it up, wrapping the cloth around the round so he could handle it without burning himself, then tucked it into his pocket as a souvenir of survival. Hines came back to check on him, asked if he had grabbed the 51 caliber, and Garcia confirmed that he had. The exchange businesslike and brief, even as the helicopter continued its desperate flight toward safety. They made it to Khe Sanh as evening was falling, the sun going down on a day that had started with a bad feeling and had lived down to that feeling in ways that exceeded anything Garcia could have imagined. Captain Milazzo put the crippled Chinook down on the ground with a controlled landing that felt like a miracle after everything they had been through. The aircraft touching down with the last of its functioning systems still working just well enough to allow a survivable touchdown. They were alive, they were down, and they were far from home, with an aircraft that looked like it would never fly again. Meanwhile, back at their home base, word had come in that a Chinook had gone down, and the crews waiting there assumed the worst, because that's what experience had taught them to assume. Helicopter losses were a regular occurrence in Vietnam, and when a Mayday call came in, and then nothing more was heard, the default assumption was that the aircraft had crashed and the crew was dead. One of Abel Garcia's friends, a door gunner named Willie Rodriguez, was working in operations when the day's casualties started coming in. Rodriguez was what the crew called a New Yorican, a Puerto Rican from New York City who had his own style and his own way of doing things that made him a distinctive presence in the unit. The crews wore their dog tags on their boots, that grim precaution against identification problems, and when Rodriguez saw the boots coming in on the bodies and spotted one that said Abel Garcia, his world collapsed. He was convinced that his friend was dead, that the Chinook had gone down and everyone aboard had been killed, and he began mourning the loss of a man who was actually alive and dealing with his own problems at Khe Sanh. The base got drunk that night, raising glasses to fallen comrades and processing the grief that was such a constant companion in Vietnam. They had no way of knowing that Garcia and his crewmates were alive, that the Mayday had been followed by a successful emergency landing rather than a fatal crash, that the men they were mourning were at that moment trying to figure out how to get home. It wasn't until 3 or 4 in the morning that they finally got word, finally learned that the crew had survived, finally could begin processing the emotional whiplash of grief transformed into relief. At Khe Sanh, the crew faced a decision about what to do with their damaged aircraft. The normal procedure would be to leave the Chinook at Khe Sanh for maintenance crews to deal with, to hitch a ride back to base on another aircraft to let the professionals assess whether the helicopter could be repaired or whether it was a total loss that would be stripped for parts. Captain Milazzo told them that's what they would do, that they would stay with the ship while he and the pilots found another way back, that the aircraft was their responsibility, and they would remain with it until maintenance could take over. But Abel Garcia asked a question that changed everything. If they could fix the ship enough to stop it from leaking, if they could patch the damage well enough to make one more flight. Would Milazzo fly it back? The captain thought about it, his own background in maintenance giving him the knowledge to understand what Garcia was proposing and whether it had any chance of working. He agreed to let them try, to give them the chance to improvise a repair that might get them home instead of being stuck at Khe Sanh indefinitely. Abel Garcia's approach to the repair embodied a kind of resourcefulness that was common among the working-class kids who made up so much of the military's enlisted ranks in Vietnam. These were young men who had grown up in environments where you couldn't always buy the right part or call a professional, where you learned to fix things with whatever you had on hand, where ingenuity and determination could substitute for resources you didn't have. As Garcia put it, being Mexican meant that if you gave him some wire and a pair of pliers, he could fix anything. A joke that contained a real truth about the skills that certain backgrounds developed and the confidence that came from having solved problems with nothing but your hands and your brain your whole life. Garcia and Hines went looking for the materials they would need, approaching the tanker crews stationed at Khe Sanh to scrounge whatever they could find. "Hey, you guys got any washers or bolts or anything we can use?" The tanker crews helped out, understanding the situation even if they couldn't fully appreciate what Garcia and Hines were trying to do, providing hardware that might make the difference between flying home and being stuck at Khe Sanh. Garcia also found a tire, something that could provide the rubber they needed for the patch they were planning. The repair they devised was simple in concept if difficult in execution, the kind of field-expedient solution that no maintenance manual would ever recommend, but that might work if they were lucky and skilled and determined. They cut pieces from the tire, rubber patches that could theoretically seal the hole in the transmission housing if they could be held in place securely enough. The idea was to put one piece on the inside of the housing and one on the outside, sandwiching the damaged metal between layers of rubber that would compress and form a seal when tightened down. They ran bolts through the assembly with washers on both ends, then tightened the nuts to compress the rubber against the transmission housing and, hopefully, stop the oil from leaking out. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't proper, it wasn't anything that any helicopter manufacturer would endorse, but it was what they could do with what they had, and they believed it might be enough to get them home. The test of their improvised repair required Abel Garcia to put himself in danger that was almost as frightening as the enemy fire they had survived earlier that day. Captain Milazzo needed to start the engines and bring the rotors up to operating speed to see if the patch would hold under actual operating conditions. And someone needed to watch the transmission while the test was happening. That someone was Garcia, the crew chief, whose job it was to verify that his repair would work. Garcia climbed up onto the top of the Chinook and lay down on the aircraft's skin, positioning himself where he could see the transmission housing and watch for leaks. Milazzo started the engines, and the massive rotors began to spin, building up to the speed they would need to maintain in flight. The wind from the rotors tore at Garcia as he lay there, pressing him against the aircraft and threatening to tear him away if he moved wrong or lost his grip. The blades were spinning just feet above his head, close enough that a moment's inattention could be fatal. Close enough that the slightest mistake would mean being struck by a rotor blade moving fast enough to cut through a human body like it was nothing. Garcia was tied off with a static cord for safety, a tether that would keep him attached to the aircraft if he started to slide, but that offered limited protection against the forces swirling around him. Hines called up to ask what the patch looked like, and Garcia studied the transmission, watching for the telltale signs of oil leaking past their improvised seal. The patch wasn't perfect. He could see a little bit of oil dripping, the kind of minor seepage that you'd expect from a repair made with tire rubber and scrounged hardware. But it was holding, mostly. Well enough that Garcia believed they could make it back to base if they flew fast and didn't push their luck too far. He reported his assessment to Hines, who relayed it to Milazzo. The captain shut down the engines, and Garcia scrambled to close the cowling and tighten everything down before they attempted the flight that would either get them home or kill them trying. The decision to fly a badly damaged aircraft with an improvised repair on a critical system was not one that anyone took lightly, and it was not a decision that any regulation or procedure authorized. But the alternative was staying at Khe Sanh indefinitely, being stuck at a remote base while their friends thought they were dead and the enemy remained in control of the territory they had just flown through. Milazzo made the call. Garcia and Hines confirmed their confidence in the repair, and they took off into the darkness, heading home on a prayer and a patch made of tire rubber. They flew low, hugging the terrain to minimize their exposure to any enemy that might still be waiting along their route, and to give themselves the best chance of surviving if the transmission failed and they had to put down quickly. Low-level flight at night was dangerous under any circumstances, with obstacles invisible until you were almost on top of them, and reaction time measured in fractions of seconds. But it was safer than flying higher, where they would be silhouetted against the sky and visible to anyone with a weapon and the inclination to use it. They pushed the aircraft as hard as they dared, flying as fast as the damaged Chinook could manage, knowing that every minute in the air was another minute for the transmission to fail, for the patch to give way, for something else to go wrong and end their desperate flight in a crash. When they finally approached their home base, they had physical evidence of just how close to the ground they had been flying. Pieces of tree branches were caught in the landing gear, vegetation that they had clipped in the darkness without even knowing it at the time, proof that they had been literally brushing the treetops in their low-level flight home. They touched down safely, the damaged aircraft finally at rest after its improbable journey, and the crew climbed out into a reunion that was all the sweeter for how close they had come to never experiencing it. The crews who had thought Garcia and the others were dead discovered that they were alive, that the bodies with the dog tags had belonged to other men in other helicopters, that their friends had survived against all odds. Willie Rodriguez, who had been convinced that Garcia was dead and had been drinking to mourn his loss, was stunned to see his friend walk off the helicopter. The emotions were overwhelming, grief transformed into joy, mourning transformed into celebration, the kind of emotional whiplash that Vietnam produced again and again for those who served there. The next morning, Abel Garcia went out to see what the maintenance crews had done with the Chinook overnight, curious to learn the professional assessment of the damage they had survived. The helicopter looked even worse in daylight than it had in the darkness at Khe Sanh, the bullet holes and damage clearly visible now, the improvised patch on the transmission looking even more primitive than Garcia remembered. The maintenance crews had pulled the transmission to assess the damage properly, to determine whether it could be rebuilt or whether the entire component needed to be replaced. The maintenance specialist who had done the inspection was a man nicknamed Underdog, whose real name was Underwood, one of the best mechanics in the unit, and someone whose judgment Garcia trusted. Underdog came up to Garcia with a look on his face that mixed amazement with something like disbelief, the expression of a professional who had just seen something that shouldn't have been possible. He told Garcia that he didn't know how they had made it back. The transmission had only 1/8 of an inch of teeth left on the gears, the metal worn down to almost nothing, barely enough material remaining to maintain the connection that kept the rotors synchronized. If those teeth had given way in flight, if the gears had lost their grip on each other, the rotors would have desynchronized and the helicopter would have torn itself apart. There would have been no warning, no chance to recover, just sudden, catastrophic failure followed by death for everyone aboard. Garcia and his crew had flown home on borrowed time, the improvised patch, and their own determination, holding together just long enough to get them to safety before the transmission failed completely. An eighth of an inch was all that had stood between them and disaster, a margin so thin that it might as well have been nothing. A gap that any slight variation in their luck would have closed permanently. Looking back on that experience across all the decades since, Abel Garcia has come to understand it as a moment when something more than luck was at work. The feeling he had that morning, the premonition that had nagged at him and convinced him to put on his chicken plate just before the 50 caliber rounds came through, that feeling had been trying to tell him something. Whether you call it intuition or guardian angels or the hand of God, something had warned Garcia that danger was coming, and that warning may have saved his life. The decision to wear the armor properly, which he almost never did, happened because of that feeling. The improvised repair worked, barely, because Garcia had the skills and the determination to make it work. The pilots kept the damaged aircraft flying through skill and will, and maybe something else entirely. All of these pieces had come together in a way that allowed Garcia and his crew to walk away from a situation that should have killed them, that by any reasonable calculation shouldn't have been survivable. Garcia has shared this testimony many times over the years, telling people that God was looking out for them that day, that they survived for a reason, even if that reason isn't always clear. It's a perspective that many combat veterans share, particularly those who survived experiences that seemed to exceed the normal boundaries of luck or chance. The randomness of war, the apparent arbitrariness of who lived and who died, could be overwhelming if you dwelt on it, could make you crazy trying to understand why you survived when the man next to you didn't. Faith offered an answer to that question, a way of understanding survival that gave it purpose and significance, rather than leaving it as just another roll of the dice in a universe that didn't care. Whether or not you share Garcia's faith, his story illustrates something important about the human need to find meaning in survival, to understand why some make it home and others don't, to believe that the universe isn't entirely indifferent to the struggles of the people caught up in its violence. Before we close, it's worth taking a moment to sit with this story of Abel Garcia and really think about what it represents, what it tells us about the helicopter war in Vietnam and the men who fought it. He was a young man, probably from a working-class background similar to so many who served in Vietnam, who found himself in an extraordinary situation and rose to meet it with everything he had. He did his job as crew chief, kept his aircraft flying, survived being shot down through a combination of skill and luck and improvisation, and then he flew home on a transmission that was 1/8 of an inch from catastrophic failure, because giving up wasn't in his nature. That's a story worth remembering, not because it's unique, but because it's representative. Because Abel Garcia's experience illuminates what thousands of helicopter crew members went through in Vietnam. The Chinook crews performed some of the most essential and most dangerous work of the war, keeping the massive logistics operation running that the American way of fighting required. And stories like Garcia's help us understand what that service really entailed. Abel Garcia's story of being shot down over Laos and flying home on a damaged transmission with an improvised patch is one small piece of the enormous mosaic of the Vietnam War. But it's a piece that captures something essential about human courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming danger. He and his crew did what they had to do to survive, drew on their training and their ingenuity and their refusal to give up. And they made it home when, by all rights, they should have died. That's a story that deserves to be told, and Abel Garcia is right to keep telling it, to keep testifying to what happened and what it meant, to keep reminding us that sometimes Something, whether you call it luck or God or something else entirely, looks out for the people who need it most.